Why do some of the smartest people in history prefer to be alone? Why do brilliant thinkers sometimes dislike being around others? And is being alone a bad thing, or is it a special gift for those with great minds? Arthur Schopenhauer, a famous philosopher from the 1800s, had a strong opinion about this. He believed that most people focus on small, unimportant things, wasting time on pointless talk and silly distractions. To him, a truly intelligent person needed space and quiet to think deeply. He once said, "Solitude is the fate of all exceptional minds." But was he right? Or is avoiding social life just a sign that someone struggles to connect with others? Think about geniuses like Nikola Tesla, Emily Dickinson, or Isaac Newton. They were incredibly smart, but they also spent a lot of time alone. Was this because their intelligence made them different from most people, or were they just misunderstood? Today, we'll explore Schopenhauer's ideas and try to understand. Do smart people really prefer solitude? And is that a strength or a hidden kind of loneliness? Now that you're already thinking about it, let's get to the first point. Imagine a genius completely immersed in his own thoughts, lost in complex theories while the world around him carries on. While everyone else is busy talking about the weather, he is contemplating the fate of humanity. While others engage in trivial discussions, he is trying to understand the nature of existence, and inevitably, he finds himself isolated. Arthur Schopenhauer believed that this detachment was not a choice, but an inevitable consequence of intellectual superiority. According to him, the more a person stands out intellectually, the harder it becomes to find peers capable of sharing deep ideas and emotions. In his view, superior intelligence creates a natural barrier between the individual and society, as the concerns and interests of the majority are radically different from those who see the world on a broader scale. A man can only be himself while he is alone, and if he does not love solitude, he will not love freedom, for it is only when he is alone that he is truly free. To Schopenhauer, solitude was not merely a burden, but a necessary refuge. He saw society as an environment where intellect was often stifled by social expectations and the trivial interests of the majority. He observed that those who were intellectually superior often felt a sense of displacement when trying to interact with the common world, as they saw beyond the obvious and understood realities that escaped general comprehension. This isolation can be seen throughout history in numerous brilliant figures. Nikola Tesla, for instance, spent much of his life alone, avoiding human contact whenever possible because he believed it would interfere with his work. Friedrich Nietzsche, another thinker who valued solitude, claimed that the crowd is a sea in which free spirits drown. But this isolation comes at a price. The need to distance oneself from social conventions can result in a profound sense of alienation. Schopenhauer recognized this dilemma and believed that while solitude could be liberating for great thinkers, it could also be a burden on the soul. This is why many of history's greatest intellectuals went through periods of depression and anxiety, not because they were weak, but because they saw the world in a way that most could never begin to fathom. And then comes the big question: is this isolation a curse or a blessing? For Schopenhauer, the answer was clear. He believed that great thinkers should embrace their solitude as a gift, for only in silence and distance from social mediocrity could they truly achieve their greatest accomplishments. Schopenhauer did not see social life as a space for genuine exchange or authentic connection, but rather as a grand theater where individuals played predefined roles, trapped in an eternal performance of appearances and selfish interests. According to him, society was nothing more than a stage where people acted for one another, hiding their true intentions behind carefully constructed masks. Sociability is, for most people, just a mask under which they hide their banality. This pessimistic view was directly linked to his main work, The World as Will and Representation, where he argued that everything we perceive is nothing more than a projection of our minds. To him, social life was just an illusion, a spectacle that distracted individuals from true knowledge about themselves and the nature of the world. Schopenhauer believed that most people were trapped in trivial concerns, status, gossip, petty power struggles, and the pursuit of recognition. In his view, the average human being was a slave to the will, a blind and irrational drive that governs our actions and keeps us stuck in an endless cycle of desires. The search for social validation was nothing more than a reflection of this uncontrollable will, and that's where the problem lies. While most people were immersed in this shallow routine, those with sharper intellect saw everything in a way that was almost cruel. To them, society seemed like a meaningless game where interactions rarely went beyond the surface. This disdain for social life was not exclusive to Schopenhauer. Other great thinkers also expressed contempt for the superficiality of society. Nietzsche, for instance, stated that convictions are more dangerous enemies of truth than lies, highlighting how people prefer to cling to illusions rather than face reality honestly. This conflict between the pursuit of knowledge and the demands of social life created an insurmountable gap between the brightest minds and the rest of humanity. The result? Intellectual isolation became inevitable. But there is a side effect. Prolonged solitude can lead to disillusionment, apathy, and even contempt for the outside world. Schopenhauer was aware of this and warned that for those who saw beyond the social illusion, the only alternative was to accept this reality and learn to live with it. But how does this isolation manifest in daily life? Why do intellectually superior individuals so often feel frustrated with social interaction? In the next section, we will explore the clash between genius and mediocrity and how it pushes great thinkers away from ordinary life. Schopenhauer did not mince words when describing his view of humanity. To him, most people were driven by superficial and selfish interests, with no inclination for contemplation or deep thought. This created an inevitable chasm between those endowed with high intelligence and the vast majority, whom he saw as distracted by trivialities and frivolities. Mediocrity generally recognizes only itself. Genius, on the other hand, sees mediocrity, but finds itself alone. This intellectual isolation occurs because the thinker is, by nature, someone who seeks to understand the world in depth. While most people are preoccupied with trivial matters such as status, gossip, or fleeting entertainment, the genius is trying to unravel the mysteries of existence. And when they attempt to share their ideas, they often encounter indifference or misunderstanding. This explains why so many great thinkers have felt frustrated with society. Schopenhauer himself despised interacting with ordinary people, believing that the mediocrity of the majority overshadowed the genius of the few. This sentiment resonates with Voltaire's famous remark, "The secret of being boring is to tell everything you know." The problem is not just a matter of communication difficulties, but a fundamental difference in interests. The genius seeks universal truths, while the majority seek pleasure and distraction. This conflict is unavoidable. To Schopenhauer, this intellectual gap made social interactions burdensome for those with elevated minds. We can observe this dynamic in numerous historical figures. Nikola Tesla, for instance, avoided social events and trivial interactions, considering them a waste of time. Isaac Newton was known for his reclusiveness and impatience with mundane conversations. Even Albert Einstein, one of the most celebrated scientists in history, admitted that he preferred solitude over the company of people who did not share his interest in deep ideas. But this distancing from society doesn't happen solely by the genius's choice. Often, society itself rejects those who think differently. Innovative and unconventional thinking frequently causes discomfort and resistance. Nietzsche called this the resentment of mediocrity, the tendency of ordinary people to despise and attack what they do not understand or what makes them feel inferior. Thus, the genius not only withdraws by choice, but is also pushed away by the hostility of the world around them. This forced solitude can lead to feelings of alienation and even a disdain for social interaction. In light of this, a fundamental question arises. If the world is a hostile place, for great thinkers, how should they deal with this reality? Schopenhauer believed there was a solution, and it did not lie in trying to fit into society, but rather in embracing and cultivating solitude as a refuge for thought and contemplation. Is loneliness a destiny or a choice? For Schopenhauer, it was both. He saw solitude as an inevitable consequence of superior intelligence, but also as an opportunity for intellectual and spiritual growth. The common man cannot bear solitude because he only feels good in the company of others. The elevated man seeks solitude because in it he finds himself. This perspective brings us to an essential point. Loneliness is not a punishment, but a privilege. It offers the thinker a chance to immerse themselves in their own ideas without distractions, without having to conform to the empty social conventions that dominate everyday life. It is in this silent space that creativity flourishes and understanding deepens. Many of history's greatest thinkers, scientists, and artists made solitude their inseparable companion. Emily Dickinson spent most of her life isolated in her home, dedicating herself entirely to writing. Kant was known for his meticulous routine and his disdain for social events. Beethoven, as his deafness progressed, found in solitude the strength to compose some of the most powerful symphonies in history. Solitude not only allows for deep thought, but also preserves the authenticity of genius. Schopenhauer believed that by becoming too involved with society, a brilliant mind risks getting lost in distractions and compromising its clarity of vision. This perspective strongly resonates with the Buddhist concept of detachment. Buddhism, one of Schopenhauer's greatest philosophical influences, teaches that attachment to the external world and social interactions often leads to suffering. True growth occurs through introspection and distancing oneself from the illusions of the material world. However, there is a dilemma in this choice. Human beings are, by nature, social creatures. The need for belonging is part of our biology, and prolonged solitude can lead to anguish and melancholy. Even the greatest thinkers, no matter how much they valued seclusion, suffered from the lack of meaningful connections. Nietzsche, for example, who also saw solitude as a path to greatness, admitted that it could be painful. In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, he describes the philosopher as a hermit who descends from the mountain to share his wisdom, only to be met with rejection and misunderstanding. This dilemma is real. Withdrawing from society brings freedom, but it also carries an existential burden that is difficult to bear. Schopenhauer, however, had a solution to this problem. He believed that while a genius could never fully fit into society, there was a way to interact with the world without being affected by its mediocrity, adopting a philosophical detachment, a kind of emotional neutrality that allowed one to coexist with others without becoming too involved. And this strategy leads us to the final point. How can we navigate the world without being consumed by its superficiality? If having a brilliant mind means ending up alone, how do great thinkers manage to live in society without feeling suffocated by so much superficiality? Schopenhauer had an answer to this, the strategy of detachment, or rather, good old philosophical detachment. Happiness belongs to those who are self-sufficient. For him, the secret wasn't about trying to fit in or making an effort to change others, but rather developing an attitude of serene distance, like an observer analyzing reality without being affected by it. Schopenhauer suggested that instead of fighting against the world's mediocrity, the thinker should learn to face it with the same attitude a scientist observes in an experiment. with curiosity, but without emotional involvement. This means accepting the banality of social life without being irritated by it, understanding the intellectual limitations of most people without becoming frustrated, and maintaining one's mental independence without feeling the need for external validation. This strategy is similar to the Stoic approach, which advocated controlling emotions in the face of adversity. Marcus Aurelius, one of the greatest exponents of Stoicism, wrote in his Meditations, "Give yourself a gift, the gift of indifference toward what is beyond your control. The world will always be a place full of futile distractions and empty conversations, but it is up to the individual to decide how much of it deserves their attention. A thinker should not completely isolate themselves from society, but rather engage with it strategically, absorbing only what is useful and discarding what is irrelevant." Despite having no patience for society, Schopenhauer did not believe that total isolation was the solution. He knew that even great thinkers needed some level of human contact, whether to exchange ideas or simply to avoid sinking into complete loneliness. The key, according to him, was to carefully choose whom to connect with and keep interactions minimal, just enough to get by in the world without going insane. This philosophy is still relevant today. In a world filled with digital distractions, fake news, and superficial relationships, knowing how to filter information and interactions is essential. Intelligence is not just about understanding the world, but about navigating it without losing oneself. Schopenhauer teaches us that instead of lamenting the lack of connection with most people, we should see it as a sign of our intellectual freedom. After all, solitude can be a burden, but it is also a privilege, an opportunity to explore our own thoughts without external interference. And now the question remains, do you prefer to adapt to the world or accept it as it is and preserve your intellectual freedom? If you've made it this far, you've probably realized that the connection between intelligence and isolation is not just a quirk of fate, but a natural consequence of deep thought. Schopenhauer showed us that great minds often find more comfort in solitude than in the company of the crowd, not out of arrogance, but because the superficiality of social interactions can be exhausting for those who see beyond appearances. The more intelligent a man is, the more inclined he is to solitude. But does this mean that being alone is the only path? Not necessarily. The key is understanding that solitude doesn't have to be seen as a punishment, but rather as a refuge. Being alone doesn't mean being abandoned. It means having the time to think, reflect, and grow without the distractions and pressures of society. And perhaps this is the true test of intelligence, knowing how to balance the world and introspection, choosing when to connect and when to step back. Schopenhauer gives us the key to this freedom, but it is up to each of us to decide how to use it. If you've made it this far, I'm sure that at some point you've felt that strange mix of freedom and isolation that Schopenhauer described. Intelligence can be a refuge, but it can also be a prison, right? But you know what? There's something deeply liberating about accepting that not every silence needs to be filled, that not every connection is worth the effort. You're not alone on this journey, even if the path feels solitary. After all, as old Arthur once said, loneliness isn't the problem. The problem is the wrong company. I remember this one time when, after hours lost in a book, I caught myself staring at the wall, reflecting on some grand idea, until someone interrupted my philosophical moment to ask if I had seen the latest reality show or heard the hottest gossip. That's when it hit me. Wanting deeper conversations is not an arrogance, it's a necessity. If you've ever been through this, you know how frustrating it is to feel like you're speaking another language, like your mind is sailing across the ocean while everyone else insists on splashing around in a puddle. But you know what? There's a bright side to it. You don't have to get lost in the noise. You have the privilege of choosing your solitude. Now, let's be real. If you enjoyed this video, you already know what to do. Hit that like button, drop a comment below, and subscribe to the channel. Or you can just ignore all of this and go back to that riveting conversation about the weather and the latest TikTok trend. But let's be honest, if you've watched this far, you already know you deserve discussions that are a little more stimulating, right? And if you think this video made you reflect, just wait until you see what I've lined up for you next. 2 videos that will make you even more restless. In a good way, of course. But fair warning, after watching, you might never see the world the same way again. Click at your own risk.